Hi, I'm Oliver Gark. You can call me Ollie. Ollie Gark. I'm a fossil fuels executive, and in fact, my real friends call me Oily Gark. And these are my associates here, the comptrollers of climate chaos. The three of us wanted to warn you about this poster, Deus Ex Machina in the Climate Code, and other questions, or what we might learn from the humanities. In it, three scholar artists from the humanities, specifically from theater, creative writing, and game design, make the case that the scenarios should be easier to understand, and that the argument for the urgency of radical policy change must be made narratively, because only this will improve public engagement with the scenarios, and also compel policy action. Well, I'm here to say, exactly. And that's why we can't have that. As an oil investor, I need to make sure my investments are secure. In other words, that all the fossil fuels I own a stake in are consumed and put into the atmosphere. To keep profits humming, I need to keep burning fossil fuels as much as possible. So please keep your graphs as obscure as possible. So we're just going to cover this on up. There we go. Excellent. And I'm just going to cover up their methods section right now. Humanities methods. These could really become a problem for me. If you enlist the skills of cultural workers who specialize in understanding audiences and being understood, that could create real problems for me. What is this? Audience attention, care to the rhetoric of data itself, reading and annotating code in ordinary language so people can understand it. Cover it up, comptrollers. Don't let anyone see this, please. Thank you. Snap. Good, good. Okay. So basically, at the heart of this poster is the typical SSP graph and scenario methods in general, and their relationship to reflexive tool design, alongside a more general type of reflexivity in which scenarios inform public policy and cultural practice in a tighter reflexive loop. But as a fossil fuel billionaire, I don't want that type of reflexivity. I don't want people to understand these data, engage with them, or take them seriously. I don't want them to be accessible to policymakers. And that's why I need you to ignore these design recommendations. Keep the scenarios exactly the way they are now. Currently, folks tend to plot all the scenarios on the same graph. This creates a rhetorical problem, though, especially when the baseline isn't clearly marked. There are many, including policymakers, who look at this graph and assume that the lines mean something that they don't. They assume that these lines are all different projections of the path we are on, that they are all projections of exactly what we are already doing with no changes. If you don't believe me, I dare you to start passing this graph around and casually asking people what it means. You'll be shocked by how many of them can't figure out which line represents the path we are currently headed towards at our present rate of admissions. In fact, there have been politicians in the United States who have pointed towards the middle lines and said, these middle lines are the average. This graph means we're already on a pretty good path. Even our allies have a pretty hard time pointing out which lines represent the actual direction we are headed in. And hey, there's even a 2020 study by Fisher et al. That says more than 50% of surveyed IPCC attendees did not understand counterintuitive climate graphs, and that these IPCC attendees interpreted the opposite meaning of what the data actually say from these graphs. This is very good news for me. Now, these humanities researchers seem to have identified 4 weaknesses using hermeneutic analysis, 4 weaknesses that are most obvious in scenarios plottings, but that can be traced back to the level of methods. Okay. First, they identified the issue of Deus ex machina in the climate code. This is an old theatrical term. Deus ex machina, or scenarios that conclude in an optimistic way without really explaining how we socially get there. The line drops in these scenarios, and we're talking the SSP 1 through 3 here, but really any projected emissions drop. These optimistic scenarios just don't have the type of explicit social structure change in them that makes a happy ending feel believable. These researchers said, enough with the Deus ex machina. We want to see more social science data to back up these emission drops. So they walked around the MOD lab, the Digital Humanities lab at UC Davis, until they ran into some of the social scientists who hang out there and ended up complaining to them about the false optimism of these Deus ex machina in the climate code. And these MOD lab anthropologists and historians started coming up with ideas. And soon the researchers were running all over campus, talking to other social scientists and folks in Native American studies and women in gender studies, who all had leads, who knew about social science data sets that could be used to make sure all projected emissions drops in the SSPs are tied to social science data. Eventually, based on this process of workshopping, which is something artists are trained to do apparently, these researchers came up with the social structure drivers as a means to banish the false gods from the machine. So they came up with 6 social structure drivers: gender diversity in leadership, ethnic diversity in leadership, percentage of energy companies that are cooperatively owned, percentage of land under indigenous management, percentage of the overall economy that's cooperatively owned, and age diversity in leadership. And they found studies that either confirm that these things reduce emissions in a measurable, predictable way, or for some of these drivers, more research is needed, but that it will likely be found that it reduces emissions in a measurable, predictable way. The study found are all over here in the sources section. And yeah, in the case of gender diversity in leadership, it looks like there's an 11.51% drop in emissions on average when a country gains 1 point on the Women's Political Empowerment Index. That's huge. That's a driver. And it could become part of scenarios methods along with these other social structure drivers. And look, in this version of the graph they made, each line is a different social structure driver. So as you get lower, with each line, a new driver is added. And the bottom line is the full scenario. This resolves one of the issues they found, namely over-reliance on backstory. The scenario graphs are just too full of abstractions. It takes secondary reading and often tertiary reading just to understand the typical SSP graphs. But when you do it this way, there's no extra reading, no multiple factors to keep track of in your head. Just one driver per line, one scenario per graph, no more than that. Just one scenario for each graph, and that's it. Any more than that, and people will get confused. Also, they identified what they call the foggy windshield effect, in which the current path we are on, which is to say, the present average rate of emissions, is not clearly marked. Since people can't clearly see which way we are headed, which path we are actually on, it makes it very hard to steer away from it. So they've added a clearly marked path we are on line in red. There should always be a clearly marked path we are on line. People would get it right away. They wouldn't need to read secondary literature to understand it and wouldn't be caught in guessing games about which line marks the present trajectory. Which is why this graph, it needs to go. There, much better. Now it's nice and obfuscated again with company profits and other things I like to keep track of in my graphs. Because honestly, profits make me powerful. I don't need personally this planet to stay habitable if I can escape on a spaceship to planet B, which is something I'm saving up for personally. Oh, I see. By the way, they also want to make line graphs of ecological wellness indicators, just like the stock market. But instead of dumping all that human attention into stocks, this is using ecological indicators to make some kind of reflexive tool that can be used to back financial instruments, in which the growth of fortunes is tied to ecological wellness. It looks like this index is intended to track, in real time, give or take, fluctuations in the predictions about temperature rise by the end of the century. It's an interesting enough idea. If folks were to come up with financial incentives backed by this to buy me out of fossil fuels, yeah, sure. If it seemed like a sure bet, I might consider it. But the truth is, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because of the slap in the face design flaw. That's when rhetorical choices are made with data parsing and presentation that alienate people. I'm not going to get into the details because we're in polite company, but basically, spoiler alert, it's probably about time to start disaggregating that population data. Basically, the way the data are parsed and isn't parsed means that they can't enter policymaker discussions or enter workplaces where these types of reflexive tools are made. So until the slap in the face effect can be resolved, and until a better level of cultural sensitivity can be brought in throughout the scenarios process at every level, there aren't going to be policymakers or tool creators who can engage these data very thoroughly. I think it's pie in the sky that population data will actually be disaggregated. So this is all a false hope anyway. Let's cover it all up. We don't want the public to understand any of this, please. Thank you. We just need to keep burning fossil fuels. Okay, I already have a bunker and a small private army to defend me when this whole society burns up and falls apart. I mean, if you actually follow these design paradigms, people are going to understand the scenarios much better. And if they do, they'll get all riled up. They might do street art and guerrilla theater. I hate guerrilla theater. And tactical performances that enhance the impact of public statements and actions through theatrics. But beyond inspiring protest theater, these changes, rooted in making scenarios more comprehensible, might inspire policy change. And that would be bad news for me. So in conclusion, don't look at this poster. Whatever you do, scroll past it, ignore it, walk the other way. But remember, today, we've obfuscated these graphics. But if your graph already obscures the truth, we don't need to bother. Thank you.